Well, I was brought up, if you like, with the CR78, which was the, as far as I can recall, the precursor to the 808. And it was a nice little machine. I mean, I have to talk about that first, just purely because of the inadequacies of that. You know, we were all grateful that the 808 came out. But I used the CR78, we were in Japan in 1978, I guess, 77, 78, and with Genesis, and Roland gave us the first kind of 3 off the production line of the CR78s, and I didn't want one at the time, you know, because I was a drummer. But I found that when I got home, my wife had run off, and I was, you know, I was starting to write, and that material became face value, and I used the CR78 quite a lot on that. But it was a very tricky machine to use because the tempo was kind of, you know, it wasn't subtle at all. And there were only a few sounds on it other than the usual sort of dance kind of, you know, waltz type sounds. But it did form the basis of In the Air Tonight and things like that. But very, very soon it seemed that Roland brought out the 808, and that was far easier to program. And so with my next record, certainly the third one, if not the second one, but the third one was No Jacket Required, and it was all over that. I mean, it was One More Night was used that. A lot of the, well, all the demos did actually, and most of the time with my recording, we used the demos as masters, you know. So it was a great tool to write with because it could be programmed easily, you know. Some of the other drum machines of the day were not quite as easy to just whip around and get something out of. And so the big thing appealed to me about it was that it wasn't really identifiable drum sounds. They were kind of percussion, kind of a little different sounds. It wasn't, I mean, obviously it was to some extent trying to replace a drummer, but the Roland machines kind of didn't really do that so much. They kind of just gave you percussion. And that for a drummer was great because you could use them without, you know, you could use them and know that you were going to replace this and this and this with real drums, but this and this and this could stay. So that's why I used them quite a lot. Well, I was never threatened, you know, because as well as being a drummer, I was a writer. And I think as a writer, it was a fantastic tool, you know. And as a drummer who writes, and I used to do all this stuff on my own. I didn't have any help, and I didn't have any other musicians. So it really was a way of, not just of keeping time, you know, but it was something you could put down, and then you knew that you could play drums on top of it. I mean, I very rarely used a snare drum and a bass drum, for example. I used all the tom-toms and the bongos and the congas sounds they had, shakers, things that would be really almost like a percussionist to my drumming. But that's probably one of the reasons why I said no to the CR78, because at that point I hadn't really started writing. And I was with a group called Brand X, which were dealing in really diverse time signatures, which drum machines at that point weren't really capable of. So I didn't see much point of a drum machine. And most of them were still stuck in the age of, you know, they weren't hip at all. Unless, you know, you got lucky with the CR78, which is obviously In the Air Tonight is one of the most sort of sampled songs around, probably for using that sound and using that song, bits of that song. So obviously there was some hip stuff in there if you managed to find it, but Yeah, I was never threatened. I welcomed it, and certainly by the time I started writing, which was very soon after I got the CR78, it was a blessing. I probably still don't know how to use it properly. I mean, you know, it was one of those things where you watched it had a series of LEDs that kind of went up and then up and then up and down the top of the machine, and it would be brighter where you'd programmed a drum. So, you know, and if you clicked on it again, it would disappear. So they weren't MIDI'd. I did get one MIDI'd at some point later in life, but they weren't MIDI'd, which means that they couldn't read time code, and they couldn't really hitch up to anything. You just started it, and that's why most 808 tracks, most 808 songs that were built on the 808 have about 4 bars of drum machine before the music comes in. It's because that was the only way you could start it. You'd start it and then you'd wait for 4 bars and then you'd come in. But I'm still not probably completely sure, 100% sure, being a drummer, how the computer side of it worked. You know, I just used it as a rhythm machine, really, and to come up with some interesting moods. The way I use, you try to get a drummer to play something simple for 10, 15 minutes, he won't do it. You know, we get bored. We'll play. No, don't do that. You know, just play. And drummers, they kind of get bored and they want to show that they can do more than that, so they do that. Whereas drum machine will just, as long as you turn it on and you turn it off, it will just play that forever. And so that was the beauty of it. I mean, the joke is that you can't pour beer over a drum machine because it will stop working, but you can pour beer over a drummer and he'll just keep going. But yeah, that was the beauty of it. It gave you a relentless, and if you used certain sounds, it would give you a hypnotic kind of feel. And that, for something like In the Air Tonight, or even One More Night, which was just a steady groove, it was kind of invaluable because it didn't have any of the frills that drummers would put in. I mean, it will suggest what can come afterwards. You know, that's the thing. I mean, obviously there were lots of things on the CR78 which they did put on the, they finessed and reproduced and took it a little bit of a stage further with the 808, which made it much more usable. But to me, the way I write is I need an atmosphere, whether it's a sound on a keyboard or I mean, obviously I write on a piano, which is a straight ahead sound, but atmospheres will tell you where to go next and suggest what you could do after this chord, and sometimes those 808s, patterns that you write would give you a great platform and something that not a lot has to happen, which is why on my stuff certainly there's a lot of space when there's a drum machine. It's good. I mean, it became a kind of a hip hop thing, and I mean, obviously the guys today are still using some of the elements. I mean, there was certain things like the bass drum was incredibly deep, and had a kind of decay which the hip hop guys, the dance producers liked, and the sort of snappy snare drum was. They've all got their character. Roland went on to do the 707, which didn't really appeal to me. It was much more of a straight ahead drum machine. The 909, which I used on things like Take Me Home, but they all have. Roland was great at making machines that had individual and original sounds. So it was very useful to have that as a kind of a colour background, if you like, to write on. Well, I don't think of it as a cold sound. I mean, I think the general consensus of opinion is that drum machines are automatic and rigid and relentless. I used the word relentless, but I meant that in a way that you probably put better as not stopping. But you know, these things are as good or as bad as the people that as the tools in the hand of the people that use them. If you're a good drummer, then you kind of program it in a way that you know it will do the job that you want. I think it's very easy to just to get nothing out of it. You know, I mean, to have it do its job, but to not have anything close to being called a groove. You know, I mean, a groove is by definition almost kind of a warm and, you know, great feel, and people would say that's a contradiction with drum machines, but to me it isn't. You know, it depends on what you program or what by luck you get out of it. So, and Sexual Healing is a fantastic example of that. And Marvin Gaye was a great drummer. You know, I mean, he played on some of the early Motown songs. You know, he knew what he was talking about, as well as being a great singer and writer. But you know, that's a great example of someone that knew what they were talking about, getting out of that machine what they wanted. You know, in the hands of somebody else, it could easily be a cold. I mean, I think the sounds I found very, very kind of stimulating, particularly the conga sounds and the bongo sounds and the kind of sounds. You know, they're kind of you could do a lot with them. You could make them kind of mellow, you know, with the desk and things, and you put a little bit of reverb on, and they would go back, and it could, you know, be a panorama to whatever you were writing. Being a drummer that writes, it's kind of tricky because, you know, you either sit there, and if you do everything yourself, I tried to record drums in my early days of writing, and you know, I'd be playing, and I had the mics over the drums, but I'd be playing, and over there was the desk, and I'd be trying to make sure that the needle moved, but not too much. And you know, then I'd kind of be, this didn't last very long, I have to say, but I'd be sort of singing what I was writing, singing along to the drumming, and then having to then after I got the drum track down, I would then go and record the music side of it, you know, the piano or whatever. And it just became impossible, really. You'd lose your place. Did I do that once or twice? Have I done the verse yet? You know, it would just become impossible. So I use drum machines as a tool, you know, I mean, and for me, it opened up my world for writing. So I never had anything other than a friendly relationship with it. It was never a threat. It was, you know, it was always a kind of turn it on and just play around, you know, and see what went with it, what went with the thing that I had programmed. But now that's a bit busy. Take that beat out, you know. And then sort of sitting there for 10 minutes, and the thing just carried on, you know, quite happily. But I found it always a welcoming instrument. You know, I never viewed it as a problematic kind of cold sort of tool. I mean, on that album, the No Jacket Required album, apart from Take Me Home, which is a 909, so obviously that had come out by that point. There was On Long, Long Way to Go, which is a song I did with Sting on that album. That's an 808. There was 808 initially on everything, because that would have been my only, along with the 909, that would have been my main source of accompaniment, you know, to write. There were probably some tracks that we kind of got rid of the 808 completely. Sussudio was done by David Frank, so he bought his own machines in. He produced that himself. I mean, I was with him, but I mean, he kind of came in with the program stuff, so I'm not sure what was used on that. But, and through to the next album, But Seriously, you know, which had Another Day in Paradise, which is 808 all the way. Father to Son, I mean, I'm just trying to think of tracks off the top of my head because I haven't looked at the sleeve for a long, long time. But it was, oh, Do You Remember? That was a big hit. That had kind of a great groove, actually. And that was just 808, you know. Overdubbed a couple of cymbal rolls, but it was, you know, it was just an exception, actually, to the rule. In terms of what we're talking about, whether drum machines have grooves or not. I mean, that was I remember sitting in an office with Ahmet Ertegun from Atlantic, you know, and him just saying, wow, what a, you know, I mean, I don't even know if he realised it was a drum machine, but, you know, it wasn't drum machine craft work, you know. It was a beautiful thing. We used in Genesis, you know, I mean, we've been talking about my career really, but I mean, with Genesis, we've used the 808 since Abacab. I think Abacab was probably the first album that we used them on the album anyway. I mean, we probably used them as writing tools, but you know, as being the drummer, I would probably, you know, I mean, it's a given that sometimes the drum machine's used and that will be replaced, and sometimes it's, you know, depending on the part, you would come in and you'd use some of the elements of the 808. One of the drawbacks was that it was not midied, so you couldn't, once you got it on tape, you were kind of stuck with it. You couldn't put it back, you couldn't lay it onto tape again, but taking out this instrument, taking out that instrument, because it had no time code unless you modified it. So, but you know, I kind of always worked around that, and so did Genesis. I mean, Man on the Corner from Abacab was one of my songs, so we used that quite heavily on that track, and even more recently with the We Can't Dance album, which was made like 20 years, 15 years after the drum machines kind of the era, because there was another drum machine called the SP12, which was an emulator made instrument, and that was a sampling drum machine. So we just sampled all the 808 sounds, and so things like fading, you know, a lot of that album of the Genesis We Can't Dance also had the 808 on it sound-wise, but of course they were sampled onto another machine because they were more flexible to use that way. I mean, I've just recently tried to buy an 808 because I've got a little studio here in New York, and I tried to get one because drum machines nowadays are so complicated, and I have got no time for that. You know, I mean, I'm being a drummer, I've never been good with manuals. I just want to be able to use it and sort it out for myself. And you know, an 808, just give me an 808 because that I know how to use, and it's like, you know, I want it, I don't want it, as opposed to, well, page 4 on, you know, if you press that button 3 times, it goes to page 3. I'm not interested in it. And the 808s were incredibly expensive, those that were still around. I mean, you know, and we thought, well, you know, is it really worth it? I mean, it probably is worth it because they're unique. But, you know, I've got something else that I use, and, you know, I don't even go near it because it's so complicated. The SP1200, because it was a sampling machine, meant that you could kind of record anything, and then obviously just put it through, just trigger something from trigger the 1200 with some other sound. And when I first had a demo of the 1200, it actually had some of my sounds on it, which I wasn't offended by. The guy suddenly thought, oh my God, he's gonna sue us. And I said, no, it's very flattering. But there were some studio sounds, and there were some sounds from the No Jacket Required album. There was some Don't Lose My Number, Tom Tom sounds, and snare drum and bass drum. And actually, on that album, the No Jacket Required album, there was a lot of drum machine, as I've said. So I thought it was kind of interesting that they sampled my drums onto this drum machine. But in fact, the drums that they thought they were sampling was actually a drum machine in the first place. So it was just still going round and round, you know, circular. But I never let on. You can make a guitar sound so different that there's no, you know, you buy a Gibson SG and it sounds, I mean, a guitarist will say, that sounds like a Gibson SG, no matter what you do with it. But to a layman, and I consider myself a layman when it comes to guitars, you know, you can put it through this, put it through that, put it through, and it doesn't sound like that anymore. Whereas you can't, it's very hard to mask the sound of an 808, and it's totally original, and it's unique. And you know, to me, it kind of typifies or personifies an era. I mean, I was just thinking that even though I stopped using it after my initial love affair with it, you know, you move on to find some other way of using it, but it still stays one of your tools in the armory, you know. But I used it throughout both sides, you know, and that was 1993. You know, Can't Turn Back. I mean, there's tracks all over that record that have got the 808 sounds on. Again, you know, by that point, my 808 was getting a bit tired, probably, so it was a mixture of 808 and the SP12 sampling the 808. But the actual 808 sounds have been with me all through my career, you know, and even on the last record, you know, in 2001. I didn't use it on Going Back because that was a Motown tribute and you wouldn't have got a drum machine anywhere near that. But yeah, I've used it throughout my entire career, one way or the other. If not as an actual standalone 808, the sounds, because they were unlike any other. I was looking I've got Giga Studios, which in themselves are antiques, but I've got a couple of Giga Studios in my studio setup, and I found myself looking for an 808 sounds the other day, you know, and it's like I'm looking for something that's basically quite simple, but I'm going through all this massive technology and, you know, banks of samples just to find something that sounds like an 808. So it sounds like I should have bought that 808, no matter how expensive it was. But I think, you know, I mean, I don't want to over-glorify the thing unnecessarily. I just think it was a fantastic drum machine, which it would be great if they still made. And, you know, because they stopped making them, one had to sample them. They didn't last forever. I mean, I've got a couple, one of which is midded and had a much more sensitive tempo clock put on it. I've got them in my little studio in Switzerland. You know, and I would love to dust it off and see if it still works. But, you know, I think the actual machine probably has some kind of magic because all the sounds work with each other, you know. So, you know, if you just take some sounds and sample them, well, you know, you can make something else out of it. You know, it doesn't destroy it. It just, sometimes you just got to have, you know, the internal circuitry. I'm sure, you know, if you have too much of this, it makes a difference to this. If you have too much of that, it makes a difference to this. So using it all in one machine has to have something special. I owe a lot, I suppose, to the fact that these drum machines existed. And it was those drum machines that we're talking about that I lent towards, instead of, let's say, the Lin, you know. I mean, you know, which was very popular because it sounded like a drummer. Well, that's not what I wanted because I was a drummer. What I wanted was something else that you could use that would inspire you to write some music that kind of had a bit of space and was a little bit more out of the box than just having something that was like a Lin. So for me, most of my the tracks, a lot of the tracks that people think of when they think of me, and I would say 3 in particular stand out: In the Air Tonight and One More Night and Another Day in Paradise. You know, owe a lot to Roland and a lot to the 808.